So welcome everyone to this, the final Humane Philosophy Project Ian Ramsey Centre seminar of this term. I'd like to thank, as usual, the Ian Ramsey Centre for Science and Religion, Blackfriars Hall, Oxford, and the Institute of Philosophy at the University of Warsaw for making this series possible. As many of you know, the theme for this series has been God, Good and Evil in a Scientific Age. Now, that might sound like a very specific topic, and as you're probably aware, when you try to get a speaker for something as specific as that, they usually pick up on one or two of the themes you've specified, but not the whole thing. I think we're very lucky today in that, by my judgment, we're going to have a talk that ties together all of those themes and effectively just gives the last word on the topic. So we might not need to continue next term. So our speaker for tonight is Philip Goff. Philip is Associate Professor of Philosophy at the Central European University. He's authored a great number of influential articles in the philosophy of mind in particular and metaphysics. And he's also the author of the 2017 Oxford University Press book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality, which many of you will know about. For those of you who don't, it might be enough to say that this book has both David Chalmers and David Papineau, arguably the foremost proponents of the two leading conflicting views in the metaphysics of mind today, insisting that this will be the next big thing that sets the debate for the future, which is obviously a really impressive feat. So without any further ado, I'd like to pass over to Philip Goff, who's going to tell us about did the universe design itself? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Is that picking up?
So won't amplify your voice, just record.
Oh, I see. Thank you very much. Thank you for that very, very kind introduction. I'd like to thank Ralph and Mikolai for inviting me here. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts on what I have to say. So my argument today starts with the so-called cosmological fine-tuning. So this is the surprising discovery of the last 30 or 40 years that the physical possibility of life is balanced on a knife edge. That is to say, it now looks like for life to be physically possible, certain numbers in basic physics, for example, the strength of gravity or the mass of the electron, had to have numbers falling in a certain range. And moreover, that range is an incredibly narrow slice of all the possible values those numbers could have. And it is therefore incredibly unlikely that a universe like ours would have the numbers compatible with the existence of life. And yet, of course, they do. So as it's often put, in this sense, the laws of physics and the initial conditions of our universe are fine-tuned for the possibility of life. So just give a few quick examples of this. First one from Martin Rees, the strong nuclear force, that is the force that binds together the elements in the nucleus of the atom, has a value of 0.007. If that value had been 0.006 or less, the universe would have contained nothing but hydrogen. If it had been 0.008 or higher, the hydrogen would have fused together to make heavy elements. And in either case, we'd have absolutely no chemical complexity, and hence no life. The physical possibility of chemical complexity is also, it seems, dependent on, in a quite precise way, on the masses of fundamental particles. If the mass of a down quark had been greater by a factor of 3, the universe would have contained, again, only hydrogen. If the mass of an electron had been greater by a factor of 2.5, the universe would have contained only neutrons, no atoms, and no chemical reactions. Third example is the strength of gravity. So we tend to think gravity is quite strong, but it's actually much weaker than the other three fundamental forces that operate inside the atom. And the result of this is that the time scale of astronomical events is much longer than the time scale of micro level chemical reactions. And this is important because if gravity had been only slightly stronger, stars would have formed from much smaller amounts of material and consequently would have been much smaller with much shorter lives, typically 10,000 rather than 10 billion years, crucially not allowing enough time for the evolutionary processes that produce life. On the other hand, if gravity had been only slightly weaker, stars would have been much older and hence would have not exploded into supernovae, which are the main source of many of the heavy elements that form the ingredients of life. So a lot of these things are to do actually with the formation of stars, which are important for getting the ingredients of life. Okay, so these are a few, I hope should give you a flavor if you're not familiar with this stuff. So why is this significant? The way people often put it, they often say, oh, well, it's just incredibly improbable that, as it were, those numbers would come up. That's and so we need a kind of explanation to remove that appearance of improbability. I mean, that's how, for example, Richard Dawkins puts it. But I think we need to say more because, I mean, although that's true in a sense, one could also say, you know, whatever numbers had come up, as it were, you know, whatever values the parameters in physics had, you could equally say, in a sense, that would be incredibly improbable. So say the strong nuclear force. So the strong nuclear force has the value 0.007. Suppose it had the value 0.006. You know, you could equally say, oh, well, of all the values it might have had, how remarkable that it had exactly 0.006. So I think we have to say a little bit more than just pointing out the improbability. I think what is striking is that the actual values are the ones that are required for a universe of value. So the fact that the strong nuclear force had precisely the value 0.007 allowed for the physical possibility of life, ultimately intelligent life, people that can write poetry and fall in love. I think it's pretty plausible that, you know, a universe in which people can write poetry and fall in love is of much greater value than a universe of just hydrogen. So I think it's maybe a little bit controversial, but so I think what many people are feeling here is that it just cannot be chance that of all the values the constants could have had, they had exactly the values needed in order to bring about a universe of great value. So I think that's what's kind of going on. Now I think that explanation I've just given of the significance of fine-tuning is fine as it stands, but it's also important to bear in mind that actually I think there is a deeper explanation to be had of what's going on here. So I think what's really going on is that plausibly the fine-tuning raises the probability that the laws of nature were designed. So this is from Bayes' theorem. We get the following analysis of probability raising. Evidence E raises the probability of hypothesis H if and only if the probability of E assuming H is greater than the probability of E assuming not H. So just to take a concrete example, suppose there's Joan's DNA is found on the body, and we take this to be strong evidence that she was the murderer. What's going on there? Well, presumably, if Joan was the murderer, it's quite likely that her DNA would get on the body, whereas if she wasn't the murderer, it's incredibly unlikely that somehow her DNA would end up on the body. So this is how we standardly understand the notion of evidence. But analogously, it seems pretty plausible that the probability of the fine-tuning, if the laws were designed, is much greater than the probability of the fine-tuning if it's not the case that the laws were designed. So if our laws were shaped by a rational agent responding to considerations of value, then it's not unlikely that they might choose the values that allow for the possibility of a universe of great value. Whereas if our laws are just brute and unexplained, or if they are the result of non-rational processes, it seems incredibly unlikely that just by chance exactly the right numbers would come up to allow for the possibility of a universe of great value. Okay, so I think that's what's really going on here. This is what's really the kind of line of reasoning that's implicitly underlying our sense that not just that the fine-tuning is improbable, but that it's improbable that it happened by chance. So this is very nicely laid out in a recent paper by an unpublished paper by Hawthorne and Isaacs called Fine-Tuning, which you can easily Google to. But my one point of disagreement with them is they think we should just drop this talk of, you know, setting it up in terms of explanation and the fine-tuning crying out for explanation and inferences to the best explanation. I think if you do that, you're going to alienate, you're going to exclude a lot of people from these discussions. I'm quite passionate at the moment about trying to get philosophy across to a broader audience. So I think it's fine to talk in the idiom of explanation, and that's what I'm going to do from now on, as long as we bear in mind, in case it's challenged, that there is this deeper Bayesian analysis of what's going on. So this is the most technical slide we're going to have today. I think it's fine to just line the point that this needs explaining, that exactly the right values came up in order to have a universe of value. Okay, so the two standard explanations one finds in the literature are classical theism and the multiverse hypothesis. So I'm going to take classical theism to be the view that there is an all-knowing, all-powerful, perfectly good, supernatural being who created the universe, and then the thought would be that that being fine-tuned the laws, gave them the values, the right values in order to make possible a universe of great value. The multiverse hypothesis, in contrast, postulates a huge, perhaps infinite number of different universes, and then the thought is, if there are enough universes, then it's not so improbable that one of them, just by chance, will end up having the fine-tuned laws, the laws compatible with the possibility of life. Okay, so I think both of these explanations are incredibly problematic. And so I'm going to spend 15 minutes or so now saying what I think are problematic with these explanations before going on to give my own alternative. Okay, so my problem with classical theism is the familiar problem of evil, the difficulty reconciling the terrible suffering and evil in the world with the existence of God. So I haven't previously done a lot of work on the problem of evil, but just thinking about this stuff, I've started researching it quite a lot over the last few months, and I've cultivated some thoughts on it, some opinions even. So I'd like to share them today and see what you think. So I want to say that the problem of evil is rooted in the following moral judgment, that it would be immoral for an all-powerful being to create the kind of universe we have. And a way to get vivid on that, I think, is, so imagine in the future if we're able to quite easily create a simulated universe. This is something that's being explored now on a lot of dystopian science fiction, the wonderful Black Mirror series, if you're familiar with that. So let's suppose that's possible. Anyone can just sort of create a simulated universe. And suppose, for the sake of discussion, something I probably doubt, but let's suppose for the sake of discussion that the creatures in such a simulated universe, if there are any, would be conscious. So suppose somebody created a simulated universe exactly like the one we have, with all the wars and pain and so on. I think the ethics committee would take it off you. You know, I think, and you could try saying to them the things Richard Swinburne says. You could say, well, these people are exercising their free agency. They're learning about difficult moral decisions. I think they wouldn't buy it. So I think this is a pretty plausible moral judgment, a pretty solid, not certain by any means, but a pretty sound, a pretty solid, rather, moral judgment. And if this moral judgment is correct, then it follows, I think, that there is no possible world in which an all-powerful and perfectly good being creates a universe like ours. So I want to say that this is a middle way between the logical and probabilistic forms of the problem of evil. So the way the dialectic is set up at the moment, it's thought that you have to choose between, you're either defending the logical form of the problem of evil, where you think that you can logically demonstrate that God is incompatible with the evil we find in the world, and most people think that's pretty implausible. Or you're defending the probabilistic or evidential version, where you're saying the evil is evidence, defeasible evidence that God doesn't exist. I want to chart a middle way between those two options. I want to say the existence of God is probably inconsistent with the evil we find in the world. So if this moral judgment is true, which is good reason to think it is, I think, then they're incompatible. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the problem of evil. I'm interested to know your thoughts on that. Okay, I want to spend a little bit longer on the multiverse, which I've been researching a lot recently. So what are the problems here? I start with a problem that's much discussed by scientists working on this, the so-called Boltzmann brain problem. And this starts from an assumption I think most scientists working on this agree with, this assumption that if a given multiverse hypothesis entails that we live in a highly unusual universe, this counts against that multiverse hypothesis. So let's take a silly example to make that clear. Suppose I have a multiverse theory according to which there are 1 trillion universes and only one of them is expanding. All the others are static. That wouldn't be a very plausible hypothesis because, we'd be in a really strange universe. We'd be in the only universe that's expanding. So that's the thought here. It has to be qualified slightly because, of course, we couldn't have found ourselves in a universe in which there are no observers, in which observers are impossible. So what most people say is, well, we take not every universe in a given multiverse theory, the set of universes in which there are observers, we take that subset of that subset of universes, and we ask, are we in a really unusual universe within that subset? And if we are, it's thought that that counts against the plausibility of that particular multiverse hypothesis, sorry. So are we in an unusual universe according to the multiverse hypothesis? Well, Roger Penrose thinks we are. So physicist and mathematician Penrose has calculated that in the kind of multiverse favored by contemporary physicists based on inflationary cosmology and string theory, we'll talk about this a little bit in a moment, for every observer who observes a smooth, orderly universe as big as our own, there are 10 to the power of 10 to the 123 who observe a smooth, orderly universe just 10 times smaller. And in fact, the most common kind of observers in the multiverse are these so-called Boltzmann brains that just spontaneously emerge from chaos for a short period of time and then disappear back into the chaos. So if Penrose is right, the odds of an observer finding themselves in the multiverse, finding itself in a large, ordered universe such as our own, are astronomically improbable. So if Penrose is right, according to the multiverse theory, we're in a really weird universe, and most people think that counts against, very strongly, the multiverse theory. Now, I don't think anyone takes this to be knocked down, because you think, well, I think the response of most multiverse theorists is to say, this is a problem, but there's the hope that we can tinker with the hypothesis to avoid this problematic implication. But I think there is a much more damning philosophical problem with the multiverse hypothesis, and I think it just does not explain the fine-tuning, which is a big problem in this context. And I'm building here on a paper from the year 2000 by Roger White, which is pretty well known in academic philosophy, but is absolutely unknown in the popular and scientific discussions of this topic. So again, this is part of what I'm interested. I think the reason it's not very well known is it's a pretty technical paper in kind of Bayesian terms. So what I would like to do, in order to try and, what I'm trying to do more generally in order to get this out there a bit more, is translate White's paper into the idiom of explanation. So that's what I'm going to try and do today, to try and get his point more generally discussed. Okay, so White's claim is, the essence of his claim is that what we want explaining is why this universe is fine-tuned. And the multiverse hypothesis does not explain that. No matter how many universes are out there, that doesn't add to the probability that our universe is fine-tuned. So here's a possible analogy to think about this. Suppose you wake up in a small room with amnesia, don't know how you got there, and there's a monkey on a typewriter in front of you, typing in perfect English. So what are you going to think? You think this needs explaining. Maybe it's a trick, maybe it's a trained monkey, maybe it's a robot. What you're not going to think is, oh, there must be trillions of other rooms in this building, also with monkeys on typewriters, because that's not going to help, because no matter how many monkeys are in other rooms, that doesn't add to the probability that this monkey in front of you is going to be typing English, and that's what you need explaining. Okay, there's a lot more to be said, though. So a lot of people, and you might, if you're familiar with these debates, be thinking this yourself right now. A lot of people think, well, this ignores the anthropic principle. So the anthropic principle can mean different things, but for our purposes, it's just the tautological truth that we could not have existed in a universe that wasn't fine-tuned, at least if we're thinking of universes with the same form of laws as our own. So it's just the obvious truth, the trivial truth that we couldn't exist in a universe where life was impossible, right? So that's got to be true. And people bring this in and say, well, okay, but this shows that we don't need an explanation of why our universe is fine-tuned, because it was inevitable that we were going to end up in a fine-tuned universe. But that's kind of true, and it's kind of not true. So White thinks people making this argument are conflating two different things. One is the anthropic principle that we could not have existed in a universe that wasn't fine-tuned. And one is what we might call the converse anthropic principle, that a fine-tuned universe could not have existed without us. The former is true, but the latter is false. So the way to think about why the latter is false, think about what would have to be the case for the converse anthropic principle to be true. It would be true if we were once disembodied spirits waiting for a fine-tuned universe to appear, and then we slip into it. If that were true, then it would be true that so long as there's a fine-tuned universe, we're going to be in it. But that's clearly not true. It could be a multiverse, and it could easily be true that we're not in it because the next universe down, rather than our universe, is fine-tuned. So in the next universe down, there's perhaps life, but that's some other folk, right? It's not us. So White thinks it's the conflation of these two principles which leads people to think the multiverse can explain the fine-tuning. Okay, so I've come up with two analogies to try and make this point clear. So if this is, I hope these analogies are a little bit more vivid than those that are currently discussed in the philosophy literature. So we've got more monkeys on typewriters. Okay, so I'm going to describe you two scenarios. Scenario A. So both you've been kidnapped by an evil terrorist. Scenario A, you wake up, in a small prison room, and the evil terrorist tells you that in the next room there are an indefinite number of monkeys on typewriters. And unless a monkey writes a sentence of coherent English in the next hour, you're going to be shot. An hour passes by, the terrorist brings in a sentence of English, and you're released. Okay, so what are you going to think in that scenario? You might think they're lying, but let's suppose you have reason to think they're telling the truth. You're going to think, well, there must have been a lot of monkeys. If there are enough monkeys, then it's not so unlikely that one of them, just by chance, is going to type some English. Okay, so that's what the multiverse theorists think is analogous to our situation with respect to the fine-tuning. But it's not. That's analogous to a world where the converse anthropic principle is true. So remember, that's a world where, we're disembodied spirits waiting for a fine-tuned universe to come up, and then we slip into it and start our physical existence. And then, if that were true, then you just need one universe to be fine-tuned, and we're safe. As long as one universe is fine-tuned, we're safe. Analogously, in this example, as long as one monkey types English, you get released. But that's not our situation. Our situation is analogous to the situation B that I'm going to describe now. Okay, in this situation, the evil terrorist sits you down in front of one monkey and says that unless that monkey types a sentence of coherent English in the next hour, you're going to be shot. The terrorist then adds that in the rest of the building, there are an indefinite number of rooms with prisoners, could be one, could be infinite, each with a monkey with a typewriter on whom that prisoner's fate depends in the same way. An hour passes by, your monkey writes a sentence of coherent English, and you're released. What are you going to think now in this situation? You've got absolutely no reason to think that there are any monkeys outside your room, because no matter how many monkeys there are, it doesn't make it any more likely that your monkey is going to be writing coherent English. And that's analogous to our situation, right? No matter how many universes there are out there, it doesn't make it any more likely that our universe is fine-tuned. So just as in the analogy, one has no reason to postulate many monkeys, so we have no reason, from the fine-tuning at least, to postulate many universes. Okay, so I'm pretty persuaded by this. Okay, now it doesn't mean that the multiverse is entirely irrelevant here. White accepts, and I think he's right to do so, that if we have independent evidence for a multiverse of the right kind, then the fine-tuning argument for design is undermined. It's a little bit technical why that is the case, we could talk about it in the discussion. But I mean, intuitively, it's still the case that if there are enough universes, inevitably one of them is going to be fine-tuned. Okay, so at this point, many people say, well, there is evidence in physics for a multiverse, so that's fine. But actually, although there is some speculative evidence in physics for multiverse, there isn't speculative evidence of any kind for a multiverse of the right kind. So I think the strongest support in physics for a multiverse comes from eternal inflation. So we have to distinguish inflation from eternal inflation. So inflation is the hypothesis that our universe began with a period of very rapid expansion and then slowed down a bit. Many physicists think this hypothesis explains many observable features of our universe at the moment, and this gives us some support, some reason to take this inflation hypothesis seriously. Now, eternal inflation is an interpretation of inflation according to which actually this rapid expansion never slowed down. What happened is, as time progressed, parts of the universe slowed down and became, as it were, bubble universes in their own right, distinguished from the bigger universe. And whether you call these universes actually depends how you want to define universe. But I hope the situation is clear, illustrated here. So we've got this larger, rapidly expanding universe and these little bubble universes that slow down and we can sort of distinguish in their own right. Okay, so some physicists think that this is the best model, the most plausible model of inflation, and so to the extent that we have observational reason to believe inflation, we've got some reason at least to believe in eternal inflation. And it's way outside of my skill set to assess those arguments, but some, very prominent physicists argue for this. So we should take it seriously, I think. But the crucial point is, insofar as I've researched this topic, there's nothing in the physics that gives us any reason to think these different bubbles would have different laws of nature. There's just nothing. And so, by principles of parsimony, we should suppose they have the same laws as our universe. So we're one of these bubbles on this view, right? But that's not going to explain fine-tune. That's not going to deal with the fine-tuning, undermine the fine-tuning argument for design, because to deal with the fine-tuning, we need these different bubbles to have different laws of nature, so that you've got so many different universes with different laws that it's inevitable that one of them is going to have the right laws for life. But that's just not what we find, as far as I've discovered. Maybe people can correct me if I'm wrong. People at this point bring in string theory. So string theory is even more speculative than inflation. It's not supported by observation, but it's supported because the hope is that it brings greater unity to physics. So in the standard model, we have 12 fundamental particles, 4 fundamental forces. String theorists try to reduce all that to just one vibrating string. And everything depends on how that string vibrates. I mean, I'm not unsympathetic to string theory. I think it's kind of mathematical metaphysics, but I'm a fan of metaphysics, so that's fine with me. Okay, so what does string theory give you? It gives you the possibility that the constants could vary in these different bubble universes. So it could be that when these bubbles slow down, the strings start vibrating differently, and it's kind of random, so we get different laws. Could be, but again, I don't think there's anything in the physics that I've come across that suggests that is the case. So I think what is really going on here is people get to this stage where you've got eternal inflation and you've got string theory, and then you bring in the fine-tuning to push it that extra little bit, and you say, well, the fine-tuning gives us reason to think probably the strings are vibrating differently in different bubbles. But if White is right, and I think he is, that is just not legitimate, because the fine-tuning gives you absolutely no evidential support for the fine-tuning. No evidential support for the multiverse. You need to already have evidential support for a multiverse in order to undermine the fine-tuning argument for design. So, I mean, it could be that future physics turns up evidence for a multiverse of exactly the right kind, but I can see absolutely no reason to think that. So it seems to me it's just a wild leap of faith at the moment to suppose that the multiverse theory is somehow going to undermine or remove this fine-tuning argument for design. Okay, so that's all I want to say about the two standard hypotheses. So we've got a problem. The two standard explanations aren't very good. So I'm going to propose a third, which is a form of panpsychism. Cue zany New Age picture. So panpsychism is the view that consciousness is a fundamental and ubiquitous feature of the natural world. So on a standard view interpretation of panpsychism, the basic constituents of the physical world, perhaps electrons and quarks, have unimaginably simple forms of conscious experience, and then the conscious experience of a human or animal brain is somehow derived from the very simple experience of its parts. So this is a much maligned view that in the 20th century was sort of treated as absurd insofar as it was thought of at all, but it's recently enjoying something of a renaissance and has become a well-respected, albeit minority position. So panpsychism can't, strictly speaking, be tested just because consciousness is unobservable. You can't look inside someone's head and see their feelings and experiences. And similarly, you can't look inside an electron and see its simple experience. But its proponents, such as myself, argue that there's a strong case for it on the grounds that it's the best account of the place of consciousness in our scientific picture of the world. The consciousness is something we know is real. We have to account for it somehow. We have to have an account of how it fits into our universe. The benefit of panpsychism, I use the word joy then, benefit of panpsychism is that it avoids the problems that plague its more conventional rivals of materialism and dualism, which we'll get to in the next slide. I just want to mention also, I think an important part, perhaps the main reason why philosophers have become somewhat sympathetic to panpsychism again, is the rediscovery of certain theses defended by Bertrand Russell and Arthur Eddington in the 1920s, which they used to defend a rather novel and promising approach to the mind-body problem. So Russell and Eddington's starting point was that physics tells you a lot less than you think about the nature of matter. So in the public mind, physics is giving us this complete story of the nature of space and time and matter. But I think what Russell and Eddington realized, and those who sort of building on their insights, is that upon reflection, it turns out that physics is really constrained to telling you about the behavior of matter, what it does, not what it is. So if you think about what physics tells us about an electron, physics tells us an electron has mass and charge, and these properties are characterized in terms of what the electron does. Mass is characterized in terms of resisting acceleration and gravitational attraction. Charge is characterized in terms of attraction and repulsion. These are matters of how the electron behaves. Physics tells us nothing about what philosophers like to call the intrinsic nature of the electron, how it is in and of itself. So the thought is here, there's this big gap in our scientific picture of the world. Physical science doesn't tell us what the intrinsic nature of matter. So Eddington's idea, building on Russell, was to say, well, let's fill that gap with consciousness. So the thought is that physical properties, these properties that physics characterizes behavioristically, just are forms of consciousness. So physics characterizes them extrinsically in terms of what they do, but in themselves, they just are forms of consciousness. So this is important because when you first think about panpsychism, you tend to think about it dualistically. That the electron, has its physical properties, mass, spin, and charge, and its experiential properties sort of sitting alongside. But that's not the view here. The view is mass, spin, and charge are forms of consciousness. Physics describes them, as it were, from the outside, tells us what they do, but in themselves they are forms of consciousness. Okay, so the thought is this avoids the perennial debate between materialism and dualism. So materialism, roughly the view that consciousness can be explained in terms of the chemistry of the brain. Dualism, roughly the view that consciousness is distinct from the physical properties of the brain. Materialism faces very serious philosophical difficulties. Dualism, very serious scientific difficulties. Panpsychism avoids the problem altogether. So there's lots to be said here. I mean, about the philosophical challenge to materialism. The point I like to press is the difficulty of materialism has of accounting for the qualities of experience. Subjective experience involves qualities, the redness of a red experience, the smell of coffee, the taste of sugar. Whereas physical science deals with a purely quantitative vocabulary. And it's hard to see how you can capture qualities in a purely quantitative vocabulary. In my view, we've never had any progress on that. And on the face of it, it looks incoherent. Dualism, on the other hand, has a problem accounting for mind-body interaction. Most dualists don't want to say that, although their mind and brain are distinct, they want to say they enjoy a close causal relationship, that the light hitting the retina causes visual experiences, conscious decisions of the soul cause actions. And there are lots of empirical difficulties, I think, making sense of this. So panpsychism avoids this altogether because we avoid the problems of dualism because consciousness is not outside of the physical order. It's part of the causally closed physical order. And we avoid the problems of materialism because we're not trying to account for consciousness in terms of non-consciousness. Okay. Did we start at 5 past or 10 past? Yeah, I'll try and leave as much. Yeah, 10 minutes should be fine. I should get on. I haven't actually got onto the main. I better speed up a little bit. Okay, I'll try and be as quick as I can. So, actually, panpsychism comes in 2 forms. So, perhaps the more common form is what I described earlier, which is sometimes called micropsychism, the view that the most basic micro-level constituents of the physical world have a consciousness involving nature, and the consciousness of the human or animal brain is derived from the consciousness of its most fundamental parts. This view is generally rooted in an assumption of micro-reductionism, the view that all facts are grounded in facts at the micro level, a kind of Lego brick picture of the universe. I'm quite persuaded by the arguments of Jonathan Schaffer that micro-reductionism really doesn't fit with modern physics, particularly the phenomenon of quantum entanglement. In quantum entanglement, we seem to have wholes that are more than the sum of their parts, and that looks to be inconsistent with micro-reductionism. But just because you give up on micro-reductionism doesn't mean you give up on reductionism. Schaffer ultimately defends or a view kind of similar to what Schaffer defends, is a kind of cosmic reductionist picture, according to which all facts are grounded in facts about the universe as a whole. And he argues that he's not interested in panpsychism at all, but he argues that this fits much better with, for example, quantum entanglement. Now, if you combine this kind of cosmic reductionist top-down rather than bottom-up view with panpsychism, you get cosmopsychism, the view that the universe as a whole is conscious, and the consciousness of the human animal brain is derived from the consciousness of the cosmos. So this is the view quick advert, another advert. This is the view I defend in my recent book. Thank you. Don't overdo it. So I argue that the universe is conscious, but I don't argue in my book that the universe is intelligent or a rational agent or anything. In fact, I suggest that its consciousness is probably just a mess. It hasn't undergone millions of years of natural selection, which you might think are prerequisite for being kind of a rational agent in some sense. But I'm now thinking that reflection on the fine-tuning might give us reason to think that the universe is something like a very, very unusual kind of rational agent. Okay, so this is the view. So the hope is we can perhaps explain the fine-tuning in virtue of a form of cosmopsychism. Okay, so I think we have to make 2 modifications to the basic cosmopsychist proposal that I defend in my book, for example, in order to try and explain the fine-tuning. The first is that the universe acts through responsiveness to value. The universe does what it does because it's responding to considerations of value. Now, this is a very peculiar hypothesis. It's not how we normally think. But I want to suggest it's consistent with everything we observe. Like most philosophers, I think Hume was right that we don't directly perceive the source of natural necessity. All we perceive are regularities, the universe behaving in a very regular way. We don't perceive the power, as it were, that drives the universe to behave in the way it does. We tend to assume that it's non-rational causal capacities, but I want to suggest it's equally consistent with observation to suppose that it's the rational responsiveness of the universe that's driving the inanimate world. How do the laws of physics fit into this proposal? Important question. I want to suggest in this proposal the laws of physics record the limitations of the universe's capacity to act. So this, unlike classical theism, this is not an all-powerful agent. This is something that acts through responsiveness to value, but in a highly constrained manner. It's not as it were. It's not constrained by something outside of it. It just has limited power, and its limitations are recorded in the laws of physics. So physics is sort of capturing the limitations of the universe. Okay, so this is going to be the idea that the universe, through responding to value, fine-tuned itself. Now, a very natural question at this point is, when? You know, it's easy to make sense of... it's not easy. We could make sense, I think, of the idea of a supernatural agent fine-tuning the universe. If it's sort of independent of and metaphysically prior to the universe, then we can suppose it could make the laws however it wanted. But if we think of the universe fine-tuning itself, if you think the universe always had the fine-tuned laws, then it's hard to see when it could have fine-tuned itself, because at any past time it already had fine-tuned laws. Fine-tuning, to remind, is the laws necessary for life. But actually, it's not at all obvious that the universe did always have fine-tuned laws. During the Planck epoch, which is the name for the very first period of the universe, lasting 10 to the minus 43 of a second, our current models of physics break down. And basically, we know very little about what was happening in this period of cosmological history. So my proposal is going to be that during this period of time, the universe fine-tuned the laws that would govern after the Planck epoch. Now, you might think this is just kind of mystery-mongering, right? I've just picked upon a gap in physics, a part, something we know, a period we know nothing about, and, you could say anything. But this is not unconstrained speculation. I'm working here with data, the fine-tuning. We've got to explain it somehow, I think. All we can do is lay out the proposals. So my proposal is going to be that the laws that operated in the Planck epoch determine the form of laws that would operate subsequently, the form, that should be sort of italicized, the form of the laws that would operate subsequently. So it gave it a sort of fixed template, but did not determine the numbers contained within them. And so that during this period, the universe, responding to considerations of value, made it the case that the parameters of physics have the values compatible with a universe of great value. Okay, so I think actually, you might think, a lot of people might think, the idea, this hypothesis that the universe is a conscious mind that responds to value is incredibly indulgent and profligate. But I want to say, actually, so far this is a very parsimonious hypothesis. At least if Russell and Eddington are right that physical science tells us nothing about the intrinsic nature of matter, well, I think the universe must have some intrinsic nature. It doesn't seem to me any less parsimonious to suppose that it has a consciousness involving intrinsic nature than that it has a non-consciousness involving intrinsic nature. Indeed, I argue in my book that, following Eddington, the only thing we really know about the nature of matter is that some of it, i.e. the stuff in brains, has a consciousness involving nature. And so from that starting point, the most parsimonious hypothesis is that the stuff outside of brains has a nature continuous with the stuff inside of brains, living brains, in also having a consciousness involving nature. So I don't think the postulation of consciousness to the universe is a cost to parsimony. Moreover, we have to suppose that there's something, I would argue, driving the behavior of the inanimate world. It doesn't seem to me, I'd want an argument as to why it's less parsimonious to suppose that it's the value responsiveness of the universe rather than that it's non-rational causal capacities. So far I don't think, I think this is win-win. I think it's hopefully explains the fine-tuning and there's no cost to parsimony. Unfortunately, the second modification we have to make does involve a cost to parsimony. So there's a problem here. If during the Planck epoch, the universe fine-tuned the laws in response to valuable consequences billions of years in the future, then it must have in some sense been aware of the potential consequences of its actions. So my proposal is that we postulate a basic disposition of the universe to represent the complete potential consequences of each of the value responses available to it. So it has, some sense of awareness of these options, and it goes for the one with most value. So I think we have to confess that the complexity of these mental representations is a great cost to the theory in terms of parsimony. However, two things. A, all that structural complexity is generated by a simple disposition. I think that's important. I think, it's important to have simple axioms to your theory. And B, I would argue that the view is still more parsimonious than theism, in that it's postulating a natural agent rather than a supernatural agent, a contingent agent rather than a necessarily existent agent. And it's more parsimonious than the multiverse hypothesis in postulating no individuals beyond the universe we're already committed to. So there's probably going to be an analogous structural complexity to both the multiverse theory and the theory I'm defending here. But in the multiverse theory, that structural complexity is realized in a huge, possibly infinite number of completely unobservable individuals, whereas in the theory I'm exploring here, all that structural complexity is incorporated within an individual we already believe in, namely the physical universe. And of course, most importantly, it avoids, I think, the two worries that, more than parsimony, I think the two big problems I discussed with the two other views earlier. Okay, so finally, this view, which we might call agentive cosmopsychism, I think can account for the fine-tuning, and in a way that is more parsimonious than, and also avoids the problems of the two standard explanations, namely theism and the multiverse hypothesis. And so as such, I think at the very least, it's a view, although it sounds quite insane, it's a view we should take very seriously indeed. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Philip, for that really interesting talk. And I really like the rhetorical image in the last slide. I think I might borrow it and use it on all my future talks, in fact. So we now have a bit of time for question and answer. Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question, and Mick or I will bring the mic to you. So, gentlemen.
Thank you very much. When you talk about a universe being conscious and driven by values, effectively, I don't see that's terribly different from the idea that it is in fact driven by God. It's not, and I don't really see the difference between your version of what is natural and other people's version of what is supernatural. Very, very blurred. Very interesting.
Sure, I think that's a very good point. And, notice I was very careful to talk about classical theism, and which many believers would not necessarily subscribe to classical theism. That's really the view I'm attacking. My biggest concern with classical theism is, the three properties of omnipotence, omniscience, and omnibenevolence, and the problem of evil does seem to me very powerful. So, if you want to start talking about God that's doesn't have all of those attributes, then that's a view I'm much more sympathetic to. But still, so you could, for example, just say, well, we have a God of limited powers, and I think that would be much more plausible. But still, I don't think you get from the fine-tuning any reason to think that this agent is either supernatural or necessarily existent. So I'm very keen on metaphysics trying to have, the constraint of the natural sciences. We're trying to find the simplest theory consistent with the data, and the data I'm talking about here are consciousness and the fine-tuning. And I think the simplest account is you have a natural contingent agent here, agent in some sense, very unusual kind of age. If you want to call that God, we could have. I've got a kind of appendix to the paper about whether we should call this God actually. But if you want to call that God, that's fine. And maybe it's a sort of non-standard kind of theism. I wouldn't be opposed to that. But yeah, thank you.
You're moderating, so you should be pointing.
I was going to ask about free will. Do you believe we are free agents? And how would that affect your agentive universe? What do you call it? Yes, how would that affect that? Because how would it look into the future if we were all free agents?
Yeah, I think that's actually a very interesting question. I think the view could be accommodated depending on what your views on free will were. So I initially said I was characterize these as sort of reductionist pictures. So I think you can characterize this view in a reductionist or a non-reductionist term way. And I think if we're just thinking about consciousness, the reductionist view is certainly fine. That's the view I defend in my book. I don't talk about free will. So the view would just be then that our conscious minds are just aspects of this cosmic conscious mind, and our actions are aspects of its actions. That doesn't mean we don't do anything. That sounds kind of weird. So you've got to picture a mind that's made up of other minds, and so I want to say that doesn't stop me doing things. I do things, but what I do is an aspect of what the cosmos does. Okay, so it's not. But you might have views about free will that strongly libertarian, perhaps that. It's not obvious to me it's incompatible even with that. But suppose you might think, maybe you do think yourself, that certain libertarian views are incompatible with that. Well, then you could have a non-reductionist view of this. So where conscious minds emerge from the cosmic conscious mind, but have a certain autonomy and independence of their own. That is perfectly compatible with this, and I could see how reflections on free will might lead you in that direction. Yeah, again, I just always want to emphasize that I'm always keen on what is the data, and then we're looking for the simplest model of the data. The data I'm talking about in my book, the data is just consciousness. Here I'm bringing in the data of fine-tuning. I'm not talking about free will. There might be other data that, and I think this is the simplest model to that. You might think you've got reason to believe in libertarian free will, and that might change what is the simplest model, and we might have to modify it slightly. But I think it wouldn't require too much modification. But yeah, that would be a whole huge discussion. Yeah, thank you.
So my question was what you mentioned about the Planck epoch and effectively being parsimonious I just want to get your opinion more in the sense of being parsimonious about that is in a sense of looking at something like an unmoved mover, going back to that Aristotelian concept, as opposed to the cosmo-psychism, which is more effectively neo-Buddhist in the sense of our beginning or end. It would have to, in a sense, look after and contain itself. Whereas what you're positing would mean that there would have to be some kind of start point, and at that start point, the unmoved mover would come into play.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I think maybe you're worried about, questions of where did the universe come from and these kind of concerns. And again, I want to make a similar kind of methodological point of the data I'm trying to explain is fine-tuning. It's not questions of where the universe came from. And I think if I'm just trying to defend this, what I believe to be the simplest account consistent with that, and the account I've defended here, we've just got a universe that begins with the Big Bang. Didn't exist before, might not have existed. Now you might then, as a philosopher, bring in what you think are other data. You think, no, we need an explanation of why the universe exists. and we could have an argument about that. No, so suppose you do think there needs to be an explanation of why the universe exists. Well, then you might want to modify this view further. But it doesn't seem to me even then, so that might lead you maybe to think that there must be, suppose that led you to think there must be a timeless or necessarily existent cause of the Big Bang. I would still say that the most parsimonious view then would be that the universe once you can't say it like that, can you? Pain of incoherence. The universe, let me be a little bit incoherent. The universe was not always, the universe itself is necessarily existent and wasn't always existing in time. So so you have the idea that the universe, as it were, once existed in a timeless form, and then comes to have a kind of temporal existence. So I still think that, because that would still be more parsimonious than believing in a necessary timeless entity distinct from the universe. I don't see any reason to go there. So I still think it wouldn't quite get you all the way to classical theism. So I just think we've got to look at what are the different considerations. Some people say, look, you might want to put them all together and get something close to a more traditional conception of God. But I would still certainly want to push the problem of evil against the very traditional conception of God. But even so, I think I would still resist the need for there to be anything distinct from the universe. But yeah.
I'm going to ask a question and then we'll work backwards, but I know there's about 4 there to reduce walking time. So I had several questions, but I'll limit myself to one, which is that it seems like there are as many possible hierarchies of preference that an agent could logically have as there are possible universes. Well, I don't know, maybe these are different infinite numbers, but they're both infinite. Given that's the case, it seems like according to agential cosmopsychism, the hierarchy of preferences of the agent we posit are fine-tuned to our existence just as much as the physical laws on the view without that agent are fine-tuned to our existence. If that were the case, it would seem like we'd only push the explanation back one stage. So do you have a move to make to avoid this problem?
Yeah, it's a very good question. So there are also, if I'm understanding you correctly, it connects perhaps, I don't think this is necessarily an objection to my view. I think this could apply equally to classical theism. There's a section of these fine-tuning arguments, say, for either my view or classical theism, how do we know the intentions of a designer? They could have any intentions, so it's still kind of, fortunate they cared about us. So I think this whole thing really relies on a non-Humean account of motivation. So roughly speaking, there are 2 different accounts of motivation. The one from going back to David Hume says that just at the bottom line is brute desires, and as Hume said, reason is a slave to the passions, right? Reason is just the slave of the passions to help you get what you want. Basically, we just have wants, desires. That's the starting point of motivation. They're contingent. They could be anything. If you have that kind of picture, then this solution isn't going to work. But then also, I think the fine-tuning isn't going to be a problem anyway. Maybe this is I think really the whole fine-tuning problem to start off with is dependent on a certain conception of objectivity of value and a certain non-Humean conception of motivation. So I didn't say what the non-Humean. So that's the Humean conception. The bottom line is just brute desires, and they could be anything. The non-Humean conception says, no, to be a rational agent, that's the wrong way around. To be a rational agent is to respond to reasons. And we have desires to a large extent because we respond to reasons. You know, sometimes they might be grand, like, you know, help making the world a better place. Sometimes it might be just that restaurant would be nice to eat in. But we respond to rational considerations. Not all the time. We're, you know, pushed and pulled as well by non-rational desires and weakness of will and so forth. But we also respond to reasons. So if you have, as I do, that kind of picture of motivation, then we can start to talk about what a rational agent is likely to want. They're likely to want valuable things. They're not going to want sort of lots of blades of grass or something. Or, you know, we can start to say it's unlikely that an agent's going to want count blades of grass. Yeah. Sorry, that was not a good example. I don't know. We can start to have some grip on what an agent is like. Whereas if you have the Humean account where it's just brute desires, you know, we've got no idea what this agent is going to. So I think the whole fine-tuning, raising the probability of a designer isn't going to get off the ground there. So actually, I mean, this is important because, you know, a lot of scientists, like Richard Dawkins, what it's worth, you know, are moved by the fine-tuning. And I think they have no idea that the whole need to explain the fine-tuning, if I'm right, is reliant on a very specific commitments about the objectivity of value and a certain account of motivation. Okay, so how does this avoid the problem? So I don't think of this agent. So you said, oh, there's an infinite amount of motivations they could have. I don't think of motivation like that. I think about motivation as responsiveness to value, and then we can start to talk about what a rational agent is likely to want, and we can start to get a grip on fine-tuning, raising the probability of an agential explanation of our laws.
Your idea of consciousness in the universe throughout its history, is that compatible with a view that consciousness was a potentiality in the universe from the beginning, and then it emerged? So that is that the same as your theory or not?
Thanks. Yeah, so I don't. No, I think that would be different to my view. I'm talking. The view is that the universe and all physical properties are consciousness involving from the very start. But I mean, to be clear on what I mean by consciousness, the word is a bit ambiguous, actually. Sometimes it's used to mean something like self-consciousness, something we'd be kind of reluctant perhaps to attribute to some non-human animals. But all I'm meaning here is experience, and it seems coherent that that could exist in unimaginably simple forms. So the panpsychist tends to think consciousness, just in this very simple sense of experience, has been there all along. And then in evolution, perhaps it becomes very complicated, sophisticated forms of agency and so on, intelligence. But basic consciousness has been there all along. You may think, why think that? Well, the claim is, so the two things going on here. Why be a panpsychist? The thought is, it's the best account of the place of consciousness in the scientific in our scientific picture of the universe. The two more familiar accounts of materialism and dualism just have such profound difficulties. Obviously, I haven't gone into that in too much detail today. But then the further thing I'm going on to is explaining the fine-tuning. So then the idea is that from the beginning there was the universe, which was a kind of value-responding conscious mind from the start. Sounds crazy, but if it's the best explanation of the fine-tuning, again, we've got the two more standard options look pretty hopeless, then I think it's a view we should take seriously. We've got to separate from these cultural associations. I think it's so hard. We're so affected by these cultural associations, and we, repelled by the idea. It sounds kind of new agey or crazy, but I think we've got to be dispassionate, and we shouldn't follow flights of fancy, but we should look at the arguments without prejudice. And I think this looks like there's a pretty good case for this view. It seems to me, anyway.
If I may very quickly jump in on that very point, because that's what I wanted to push back against a little bit. I mean, I balk slightly at the idea of electrons having this unimaginably basic consciousness. And this is for the following reason. If electrons had this unimaginably basic consciousness, it seems to me it'd be as basic as the consciousness of this lectern. Or of this shoe, because normally we seem to think when we refer to something as conscious of at least animal life, and you said this yourself. So I think we would need to account, and I don't think evolution is a good crane here, because evolution pertains to life anyway. So we would still need to explain how we get from this extremely basic consciousness to what we normally understand as consciousness, which is the thing that responds to value and has moral worth and all that. So I think in a sense, the question that you pose when you try to push back against physicalism is still preserved in a way in the panpsychist view, because you're still left with the problem of how do you jump from this really basic thing that is nothing like the consciousness that we find as an odd thing in the physicalist picture of the universe appearing.
Maybe I just have to hear more about why you think that would be such a big jump. To me, that the hard problem of consciousness, as it's often called, is the problem of experience. It's very hard to understand how make sense of how experience can arise in a physical system, and there are all sorts of, I talked about qualities and quantities, all sorts of aspects to that. But once you've got experience, it's not obvious to me what other features there are that, that can't be accounted for in terms of evolution by natural selection, complicated physical structure. So I don't know, maybe you're thinking about free will, or I don't know, we could talk about that. It's not obvious to me. If you are concerned about free will, maybe that could exist in very basic forms, and we have a similar kind of story. Not that I'm saying that, but depends on your view of free will. So yeah, it's not obvious. I'd want to hear more about which features you think would be problematic in terms of blocking a kind of account of human consciousness and mental life in terms of more basic forms of experience and physical complexity.
Yeah, so first of all, thank you. I really enjoyed that. My question, I think, is connected to has been said. So your concern with materialism was especially phenomenal consciousness, so the redness of red, the sweetness of sugar, and the like. But I take it that most materialist account of what's sometimes labeled access consciousness are fine. You might just take your favorite theory of functionalism, and then there you go. So this being said, then I assume, maybe I'm wrong in assuming that panpsychism basically is motivated as a theory of phenomenal consciousness. And then I was wondering, like, how do you actually get the step then to ascribe intentions to the universe, which then, in a way, leave the space of phenomenal consciousness and go to access consciousness, where we have better theories, where we do not depend on panpsychism. So, like, yeah, how do you make that step?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. So, well, I guess you say we've got better theory. We could go with functionalism or just talk about. I mean, I guess I don't think any of those theories work in terms. If you're talking about accounting for phenomenal consciousness, or maybe I've misunderstood. So, I mean, look, that's a big argument, and I've said hardly anything on it. The first half of my book is arguing, that any, physicalism cannot account for phenomenal consciousness. But you're right. But it's that specific target. But that's a huge debate, and obviously. That's not an easy case to make, and so that's the fundamental motivation for panpsychism, that physicalism can't account for phenomenal consciousness experience, and so dualism is problematic for empirical reasons. So panpsychism is, so that's the whole case there, and you're quite right that doesn't get you the universe having motivations, as the view I defend in my book, that I say the universe is not, it doesn't mean the universe is God, and it's just a mess, probably. The extra step comes from the fine-tuning. I think the fine-tuning is hard, serious empirical data, and we're looking for an explanation of it. And so if we've already got a conscious mind, the universe is a conscious mind, then the thought is this extra postulation can account for the fine-tuning. And as I say, we could have an argument about this. I don't think the supposition that the universe acts through responsiveness to value is any less parsimonious than the view that it acts through through non-rational causal capacities. I'd want an argument for that. What was I going to say? Yeah, so it's an interesting. You made me think. It's an interesting question. What if you weren't a panpsychist? If you thought phenomenal consciousness could be completely explained, that wasn't a problem. And then you were thinking about. I don't think that, but say you were thinking about that, and then you wanted to explain the fine-tuning. Would this theory still be plausible? I have to think about that, but I say probably. Yeah, probably still plausible.
Thank you so much. That was really interesting. So my question also has to do with this slide. So you said that panpsychism, one of the good things about it is that it fits very well with our scientific view of the world. And one of those views is that the causal closure of the physical, right? So my question is, how would you, unlike dualism, account for mental causation? So how does this initial state, phenomenal state of the universe, cause all the other physical stuff?
Excellent. I mean, this is exactly the motivation for panpsychism, that it doesn't have the problem of causal closure of the physical. It says exactly what the physicalist says, because so on this view, the important point, as I tried to, is that it's not that that physical things have physical properties and these mental properties. The view is that physical properties are forms of consciousness. So take the brain level. There are these states of the brain that the neuroscientist talks about and characterizes extrinsically in terms of their causal role in the brain. And the view is, in there, those states are forms of consciousness. There aren't two things. As it were, the neuroscience scientist describes them from the outside in terms of what they do. In their intrinsic nature, they are forms of consciousness. So there's no causal closure problem, because the properties a neuroscientist is talking about, those physical properties, are forms of consciousness. And the properties the physicist is talking about are forms of consciousness. So that's the attraction. It avoids all the philosophical problems of dualism and the empirical causal closure worries of dualism. And the only problem with it is, in my view, it feels a bit weird and it sounds new age to us. And I just think this is not a serious concern. You know, it solves all these deep difficulties, and we should really, separate, start thinking objectively and separate from these, unfortunate cultural associations. But yeah, that's precisely the attraction of causal closure.
Thanks. The scientist Rupert Sheldrake, in some of his books, I think he argues that these constants could have evolved. And I wonder whether that could help to explain why we're fine-tuned.
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I wrote a popular article on this recently, and a lot of people, not a lot of people, some people were tweeting me this exact question, which had never occurred to me, that the constants could have changed. That would make a profound difference if because the biggest problem with this theory is this second modification. That the universe has to know what's going to happen in the future, so you've got to have these very complex mental representations. If the constants could change, then you could potentially have a much more attractive theory. That is the most worrying part of the theory, although I argue it's still better than the other options. On that, though, I just think I'm not a physicist. All I'm reporting on here is reading, trying to understand the physics as best I can, popular level. I'm not a physicist, so I feel I have to go with the consensus of physicists, which is that the constants have not changed since very early on in cosmological history. So Sheldrake, says he has empirical evidence for his non-standard views, and I find that very interesting. But I don't feel I'm in a position to be able to assess that as someone who's a philosopher rather than an empirical scientist. So maybe in the future, Sheldrake will be proved right, and the philosophers can start to think differently. But I feel like I have to trust the consensus of empirical scientists. So
I'm afraid I know there are several more questions in the room, and this has been a really energized question and answer session. However, we do promise people we'll finish by about 15:15, and we don't want to put people under pressure to stay here. There will, however, be an opportunity to ask Philip questions personally during the next 15-20 minutes or so, when we invite you to have another glass of wine and stick around. But before doing that, could you please thank once again Philip Goff for a really interesting talk.